30 years. That's how long it's been since the world watched Raccoon City burn. 30 years since a missile strike turned a Midwestern American town into ground zero for humanity's first real confrontation with bioterrorism on a scale that couldn't be hidden, couldn't be denied, couldn't be explained away as isolated incidents or urban legends. On October 1st, 1998, the United States government made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of Resident Evil's universe. They erased an entire city from the map, vaporized over 100,000 souls, and then spent the next generation lying about why. And now we're going back. Resident Evil Requiem isn't just another entry in Capcom's survival horror franchise. It's not another village with a tall vampire lady, not another Louisiana swamp house with a family of mold-infected murderers, not another island populated by cultists with parasite problems. Requiem is taking us back to where it all began, back to the ruins of Raccoon City, and what Capcom is planning to do there might fundamentally alter everything we thought we knew about this series. The question isn't whether Requiem will be scary, or whether it'll have good gameplay, or whether it'll satisfy fans. The question is this: what truth has been buried under 30 years of rubble and radiation? Why does that truth matter enough to build an entire game around excavating it? This is speculation, analysis, and detective work. This is connecting dots that Capcom has been dropping since Resident Evil 7 launched in 2017. This is about understanding why the franchise's 9th mainline entry isn't moving forward but deliberately stepping backward into a mass grave. So settle in. We're going deep into the ruins of Raccoon City, and by the end of this investigation, the entire Resident Evil timeline might look very different than it did before. The return that changes everything. When Capcom closed out Summer Game Fest 2025 with the Resident Evil Requiem reveal trailer, the crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. That slow pan across destroyed streets, the collapsed sections of the Raccoon Police Department, the crater where downtown used to stand, and then that title, Requiem, not Resident Evil 9, not a subtitle promising a new location or new threat. Requiem, a mass for the dead, a prayer for souls departed, an acknowledgement that what happened here demands mourning, demands remembrance, demands reckoning. Director Koshi Nakanishi, who previously helmed Resident Evil 7 and returned the franchise to its survival horror roots after years of increasingly action-heavy entries, made a fascinating comment during an interview at Tokyo Game Show. He said returning to Raccoon City felt like opening a rice cooker that had been forgotten for a week, that eventually curiosity makes you lift the lid to see what's become of what was left inside. It's a visceral image, that sense of decay and transformation, of something that should have been dealt with properly, but was instead abandoned to rot. That's Raccoon City in 2026, or possibly 2028, depending on how exactly Capcom calibrates the timeline. A wound left to fester for 3 decades. The game's release date, February 27th, 2026, isn't arbitrary. The Resident Evil franchise celebrates its 30th anniversary in 2026, marking 3 decades since the original game terrified PlayStation owners in 1996. But more significantly, if we assume Requiem takes place in its release year the way Village did in 2021, that puts the game's events approximately 28 years after Raccoon City's destruction in October of 1998. Close enough to 3 decades that about 30 years works perfectly as the vague time frame Capcom has been using in marketing materials. This timing matters because of what 3 decades represents: a generation. Everyone who was an adult during the Raccoon City outbreak is now middle-aged or elderly. Children who were born in the aftermath have grown up knowing Raccoon City only as historical tragedy, as the bioterrorism event that changed the world, as ground zero for legislation and military protocols and international treaties governing biological weapons. The ruins have sat sealed off, a radioactive exclusion zone patrolled by military forces and restricted to authorized government personnel. For 30 years, Raccoon City has been simultaneously the most important location in Resident Evil's universe and a place nobody could access. A gap in the map, a hole in history, until now. Grace Ashcroft, FBI technical analyst, receives assignment to investigate the Renwood Hotel, located either within the Raccoon City exclusion zone or close enough to its borders that the investigation inevitably leads there. Her briefing from FBI Special Agent Nathan Demps frames this as a routine case. Mysterious deaths, possible disease outbreak, standard investigative protocol. But Grace knows something Demps doesn't mention in his official briefing. 8 years ago, in 2018, if our timeline calculations are correct, her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, was murdered at the Renwood Hotel. And Alyssa Ashcroft wasn't just any victim. She was one of the few documented survivors of the Raccoon City outbreak. She was an investigative journalist who'd spent years uncovering Umbrella Corporation's crimes. She was someone who knew secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. And now her daughter is being sent to the exact location where she died. This isn't coincidence. Nothing in Resident Evil is ever coincidence. The question is whether Grace is being given an opportunity to find truth, or whether she's being set up, being positioned as another loose end to be eliminated the way her mother was. The Requiem trailer shows Grace as nervous, disorganized, clearly uncomfortable with confrontation or violence. Her FBI office is cluttered with papers, coffee cups, the detritus of someone who lives at their desk because field work terrifies them. She's late submitting reports. She stammers when Demps assigns her the case. Everything about Grace Ashcroft screams analyst, not operator. She's supposed to review case files and compile data, not investigate active crime scenes in radioactive exclusion zones, which makes her absolutely perfect for what Capcom is trying to accomplish with Requiem. Because Grace isn't a super soldier like Chris Redfield, isn't a special agent like Leon Kennedy, isn't even particularly brave or competent with weapons. She's us. She's someone completely unprepared for the horrors she's about to face. Someone whose analytical mind will be pushed to its breaking point by trauma, paranoia, and the growing suspicion that she's not investigating a case so much as walking into a trap designed specifically for her. The vulnerability is intentional. The fear is the point. Nakanishi has stated explicitly that they wanted a protagonist who gets scared, who feels like an introvert thrown into situations beyond their capacity to handle. This is Resident Evil 7's Ethan Winters concept, refined and intensified. But here's where things get interesting. Here's where the story Capcom is telling stops being about one frightened woman investigating her mother's death and starts being about something much larger, much more dangerous, much more fundamentally destabilizing to everything the Resident Evil franchise has built over 30 years. Because Grace Ashcroft isn't just Alyssa's daughter. She might be the key to understanding what really happened to Raccoon City, and more importantly, what's been happening there ever since. The outbreak survivor who knew too much to understand what Requiem is really about. We need to understand Alyssa Ashcroft, not the murder victim, not the mother whose death motivates Grace's investigation. Alyssa, the character, Alyssa, the survivor, Alyssa, the journalist who spent 5 years documenting Umbrella's crimes before the Raccoon City outbreak, and another 22 years afterward trying to expose truth that governments and corporations desperately wanted suppressed. Alyssa first appeared in Resident Evil Outbreak, Capcom's 2003 attempt at online cooperative survival horror on PlayStation 2. While the game itself received mixed reviews, largely because Capcom never bothered setting up servers for European players, forcing them to experience an online-focused game offline with longer load times, its narrative importance has grown significantly in retrospect. Outbreak told the stories of ordinary Raccoon City residents trying to survive the zombie apocalypse, focusing not on special forces teams or police officers, but on civilians, a bartender, a university student, a plumber, a waitress, and Alyssa, the investigative journalist. Alyssa's defining characteristic in Outbreak was her lock-picking ability. She could bypass locked doors and containers that other characters needed keys to access, a mechanical advantage that represented her journalistic talent for getting into places she wasn't supposed to be, uncovering information people wanted hidden. Her backstory involved investigating Umbrella even before the outbreak, specifically looking into illegal drug testing at a private hospital in the Arklay Mountains. In 1993, 5 years before Raccoon City's destruction, Alyssa and her colleague Kurt Diamond infiltrated that hospital to gather evidence. Kurt was killed by an infected patient, specifically by Dorothy Lester, the hospital director's wife who'd been infected with T-virus during experimental treatments. To prevent Alyssa from exposing what happened, Umbrella researcher Greg Muller captured her and used a memory suppression technique to make her forget the specifics of what she'd witnessed. This memory suppression didn't stop Alyssa from continuing to investigate. She knew something had happened at that hospital. She knew people had died. She knew Umbrella was involved. The suppression just prevented her from having the concrete evidence needed for exposure. So she kept digging, kept following leads about strange deaths and missing people and corporate corruption, compiling a portfolio of circumstantial evidence that pointed toward something massive and criminal happening in her city. Then, September 1998 arrived, and Umbrella's sins came home to roost in the form of citywide viral outbreak. Alyssa survived, not through action hero competence or military training, but through journalist instincts, knowing when to run, when to hide, when to trust strangers, when to risk everything for information. During the outbreak, she returned to the Arklay Hospital with other survivors, and there her suppressed memories finally returned. She remembered Kurt's death. She remembered Dorothy Lester's transformation. She remembered Umbrella's experiments. She remembered everything they'd tried to make her forget, and she escaped. Alyssa Ashcroft was one of the few documented survivors of the Raccoon City outbreak. She got out before the missile strike on October 1st. She received treatment for the Epsilon strain of T-virus she'd contracted from contaminated water during her escape, and she spent the next 20-plus years trying to expose what had really happened in Raccoon City. This is where the timeline gets fascinating and where Capcom has been playing an extremely long game. In Resident Evil 7, which takes place in Louisiana in 2017, players can find a newspaper article written by Alyssa Ashcroft. It's dated 2016 and discusses mysterious disappearances in Dulvey Parish, Louisiana, the exact location where the Baker family has been murdering people under the influence of Eveline's mold-based infection. This Easter egg seemed minor at the time, just a neat callback to Outbreak for longtime fans. But now, knowing that Alyssa's daughter becomes the protagonist of Resident Evil Requiem, that newspaper article takes on new significance. Alyssa wasn't just investigating random disappearances. She was tracking bioorganic weapon incidents. She was following the trail of Umbrella's legacy, documenting cases where experimental bioweapons continued causing deaths long after the parent corporation had supposedly been destroyed. Between 2017, when she wrote about Dulvey, and 2020, when she was murdered at the Renwood Hotel, Alyssa was clearly getting close to something, close enough that someone decided she needed to be eliminated. The question is what? What had she discovered? What truth was dangerous enough to warrant killing a journalist who'd already survived Raccoon City, who'd spent 2 decades exposing Umbrella's crimes, who should have been protected by her public profile as a documented survivor and her work as an investigative reporter? What was she investigating at the Renwood Hotel that got her killed? And this brings us to the core speculation that Requiem might be built around, the theory that makes everything else make sense, the possibility that Capcom has been carefully laying groundwork for since Resident Evil 7. Alyssa wasn't just investigating past crimes. She discovered that Raccoon City didn't actually end in 1998. What if the outbreak never stopped? The official narrative about Raccoon City has always been straightforward. Umbrella's underground laboratory suffered containment breach. T-virus and G-virus escaped into the city's water and sewer systems. Infection spread rapidly through the population. Government response was inadequate. Umbrella deployed its biohazard countermeasure service, which failed to contain the situation. National Guard established perimeter. On October 1st, 1998, the United States government launched a sterilization operation, firing a missile or missiles, accounts vary, that completely destroyed Raccoon City in a thermobaric blast designed to eliminate all biological contamination. End of story. Raccoon City ceased to exist. The ruins were sealed off as an exclusion zone due to lingering radiation and potential biological hazards. Over the next 3 decades, Raccoon City existed only as historical event, as cautionary tale, as the incident that forced the world to acknowledge bioterrorism as existential threat requiring international cooperation and oversight, except we know from various Resident Evil games that Umbrella's viruses don't behave like normal pathogens. They don't simply die when exposed to high temperatures or radiation. T-virus is remarkably resilient. G-virus is even more so. These are engineered organisms designed to be weapons, to survive hostile conditions, to adapt and evolve in response to environmental pressures. The Raccoon City missile strike would have killed the zombies and other infected creatures. The extreme heat and pressure would have destroyed most biological material. But viruses are microscopic. Virus samples stored in reinforced containers deep underground in Umbrella's facilities wouldn't necessarily be destroyed by the blast. And if those samples survived, if even a small amount of viable viral material remained in the ruins, then Raccoon City isn't dead, it's dormant. Think about the implications. An exclusion zone sealed off for 30 years, no public access, limited even for government personnel, due to radiation hazards and potential biological contamination. That's the official explanation. But what if the biological contamination isn't potential? What if it's active? What if the United States government has been maintaining that perimeter not to keep people away from ruins, but to keep something contained? What if Raccoon City has been slowly transforming beneath that seal for 3 decades? Viral material interacting with radiation, mutating in the dark, creating something new and infinitely more dangerous than anything that existed in 1998. This would explain several otherwise puzzling elements of Requiem's marketing. The trailer's emphasis on psychological horror rather than action, the darkness, the need for Grace's lighter to illuminate her environment, the stalker enemy that can move through walls and ceilings, described in early previews as one of the most terrifying creature designs in franchise history. The game's subtitle, Requiem, a mass for the dead. But what if the dead never actually died? What if they've been evolving for 30 years in an environment that combined biological warfare agents with radioactive contamination? The real-world parallels are chilling. Chernobyl's exclusion zone became an unintentional nature preserve where animals thrived without human presence, despite radiation. But the animals that evolved there showed genetic abnormalities, adaptations to radioactive environment that make them distinct from populations outside the zone. Now imagine that process applied to T-virus infected organisms. Imagine what 30 years of mutation and adaptation might create. Imagine what could emerge from those ruins when Grace Ashcroft opens the door. And here's the terrifying part. If this theory is correct, if Raccoon City has been an active biohazard zone for 3 decades, then the United States government has been lying about it for just as long. The sterilization operation didn't actually sterilize anything. It just contained the problem, sealed it away, and then spent 30 years ensuring nobody looked too closely at what was happening beneath that seal. Anyone who got too close, anyone who started asking the wrong questions, anyone who began connecting dots that led back to Raccoon City's ruins, anyone like Alyssa Ashcroft, the Spencer theory, when the dead return to judge. The living one of the most explosive pieces of speculation emerging from the community involves the mysterious hooded figure who appears throughout Requiem's trailers. For months, fans have been dissecting every frame, every shadow, every glimpse of this character, trying to determine their identity. The theories range from plausible to absurd. Albert Wesker's clone, Brandon Bailey from The Connections, Leon Kennedy gone rogue, the merchant from Resident Evil 4, even Nikolai Zinoviev somehow surviving all these years. Then director Koshi Nakanishi and producer Masato Kumazawa shut it all down at Tokyo Game Show, confirming explicitly that the hooded figure is a new character created specifically for Requiem's storyline, not a returning face, not fan service, something original. But here's where it gets interesting, where community speculation has evolved beyond simple identity guessing into something more profound and disturbing. The Road to Requiem video hosted by Maggie Robertson features a conspiracy board, the kind of crazy wall that FBI investigators and obsessed detectives build when connecting disparate pieces of evidence into coherent narrative. And on that wall, among the photos of Leon Kennedy, Claire Redfield, Ada Wong, Grace Ashcroft, and her mother Alyssa, there's one face that stands out as conspicuously referenced. Oswell E. Spencer, Umbrella Corporation's founder, and arguably the franchise's original architect of horror. Spencer died in Resident Evil 5, murdered by Albert Wesker in a confrontation that exposed Spencer's ultimate goal, achieving godlike immortality through viral enhancement. His death should have closed that chapter. His legacy should have ended with Umbrella's dissolution. But what if it didn't? What if Spencer's obsession with immortality, with transcending human limitations through bioweapon research, didn't die with him in that wheelchair at his estate? Consider the clues Requiem's marketing has been dropping. The hooded figure wears elaborate clothing that seems anachronistic, almost Victorian in its styling, suggesting someone disconnected from modern fashion, someone whose aesthetic sensibilities were formed in a different era. The figure moves with purpose and authority, suggesting intelligence and planning rather than mindless aggression. And in one crucial shot from the Gamescom trailer, We see this character sitting at a desk, removing goggles, revealing a prominent scar running down their chest, surrounded by paintings and artifacts that scream old money, old power, old ambitions. We have so much work to do, the figure says, their voice carrying weight of someone who views their activities not as crimes, but as necessary research, as the continuation of important work, interrupted but never abandoned. This is the Spencer theory in its most developed form, that the hooded figure isn't Spencer himself, but rather someone carrying forward his vision, someone who either worked directly with Spencer or has inherited his research, his goals, his fundamental belief that humanity's next evolutionary step requires embracing bioweapon enhancement. This could be a protege, a cultist, even a family member, someone who views the Raccoon City incident not as tragedy, but as data point, as experiment that produced valuable results despite unfortunate civilian casualties. The theory gains weight when we consider what the Renwood Hotel might actually be. If it's not really a hotel, but rather a research facility disguised as civilian structure, then who built it and why? If Alyssa Ashcroft was investigating umbrella-related activity there and was killed for it, then who had both the resources to maintain secret bioweapon research facility and the motivation to eliminate a journalist asking uncomfortable questions? Spencer's network didn't disappear when he died. His fortune didn't evaporate. His research notes didn't burn. Someone inherited all of that. Someone who might have spent the years since Spencer's death in 2009 continuing his work in secret, using facilities like the Renwood Hotel to monitor and study what's been evolving in Raccoon City's sealed ruins. Someone who views Grace Ashcroft not as threat, but as opportunity, as the daughter of a survivor whose blood might carry antibodies, genetic mutations, adaptations that 20 plus years of post-infection life produced. You are the chosen one, the voice tells Grace in trailers. Not threatened, not hunted, chosen, selected for purpose. That's not the language of elimination, that's the language of experiment. Grace isn't being killed like her mother was. She's being harvested, being prepared for something, being positioned as the next step in research that began when Oswell Spencer first dreamed of creating humans who could survive and thrive in worlds contaminated by bioweapons. The scar on the hooded figure's chest becomes crucial detail here. Scars suggest survival of trauma, of surgery, of modification. If this character underwent bioweapon enhancement, if they're a willing subject of the kind of experimentation Spencer championed, then that scar could be surgical site, the place where viral agents were introduced, where human biology was deliberately altered in pursuit of Spencer's vision of enhanced humanity. This transforms Requiem from simple survival horror into something more philosophically complex. The question isn't just whether Grace survives the Renwood Hotel and Raccoon City's ruins. It's whether she becomes what the hooded figure wants her to be, whether she accepts or rejects the transformation being offered, whether humanity's future involves embracing bioweapon enhancement as evolutionary tool rather than terrorist threat. And here's the darkest implication. What if Spencer was right? What if the only way humanity survives in a world where bioweapons exist is by becoming something that can coexist with viral contamination, something enhanced and modified and no longer purely human? What if the hooded figure isn't villain but prophet, someone who understands that Raccoon City's ruins aren't cemetery but laboratory, that 30 years of viral evolution in sealed environment has produced the blueprint for humanity's next stage? Grace Ashcroft might not be investigating her mother's murder. She might be fulfilling her mother's purpose, becoming what Alyssa's survival and subsequent reproduction created a bridge between human and post-human, someone whose genetics carry keys to understanding how life adapts to bioweapon saturation, the chosen one, not for heroism, for transformation, the light and the freeze, environmental mechanics that change everything. One of the most discussed aspects of Requiem's revealed gameplay involves the interaction between Grace's lighter and the enemy AI, specifically the unsettling behavior of the white-gowned enemies who appear throughout trailers in various states of movement and stillness. Community speculation has coalesced around a theory that could fundamentally change how Resident Evil approaches enemy encounters. What if light doesn't just illuminate the environment, but actively affects enemy behavior? The evidence is subtle but consistent across multiple trailer shots. We see Grace holding her lighter, approaching a white-gowned figure who stands motionless like a statue. The figure's posture is wrong for typical zombie, too still, too balanced, frozen mid-motion, as if time stopped. Grace seems to be testing something, waving the light near the figure's face, curious about whether it will react. The figure doesn't move, doesn't attack, doesn't even seem to register Grace's presence while the light is active. Then, in other shots, we see similar white-gowned enemies moving through the chronic care center, walking upstairs, pressing against mirrors. They're active, mobile, clearly responsive to stimuli. The difference between these states isn't random. The theory gaining traction is that these enemies freeze when exposed to light sources, becoming temporarily statue-like, and reactivate when darkness returns. This creates a completely new survival horror dynamic. Traditional Resident Evil games give you light as tool for seeing threats. You illuminate dark corners to spot zombies before they grab you. You use flashlight to track enemies in shadow. Light is passive reconnaissance tool. But if Requiem makes light active defense mechanism, if shining your lighter at an enemy freezes them temporarily, then every encounter becomes risk-benefit calculation. Do you keep your lighter lit to see where you're going, potentially freezing nearby enemies, but also draining fuel and attracting the stalker enemy that's drawn to light sources? Or do you navigate in darkness, conserving fuel and staying hidden, but risking collision with enemies you can't see? The tension compounds because you need light to solve environmental puzzles, read documents, examine key items. But every second the lighter burns, you're broadcasting your location and depleting limited resource. The implications extend beyond simple stealth mechanics. If enemies freeze in light, then encounter design can force players into impossible choices. Imagine a hallway with multiple white-gowned enemies positioned to block your path. You can light your lighter to freeze them, creating safe passage, but the hallway is long and the lighter's fuel won't last. You make it halfway before the flame dies. The enemies behind you unfreeze immediately. The enemies ahead are still active. You're trapped in darkness between two groups of hostile entities, with no light and no way to freeze them again until you find more fuel. Or consider the psychological horror of enemies who freeze in light but remain aware. What if they're not really frozen but paralyzed, conscious and watching but unable to move while illuminated? What if breaking eye contact causes immediate reactivation, turning every encounter into nightmarish staring contest where you must maintain visual focus on threat while navigating around it, backing away slowly, never blinking, never looking away? This mechanic would explain why the Chronic Care Center features so many lights, ceiling fixtures, lamps, windows with external illumination. These aren't just aesthetic choices, they're strategic elements. Lit areas might offer safety zones where enemies can't function, but they also limit your ability to hide, make you visible to anything that can see, including the stalker enemy that's allegedly attracted to light sources. The white-gowned enemies themselves become more interesting under this interpretation. They're not zombies, they're not typical infected. They're something that evolved in Raccoon City's ruins over 3 decades, something adapted to darkness and shadow, something that thrives in the sealed exclusion zone where sunlight never reaches contaminated lower levels. Light isn't just uncomfortable for them, it's antithetical to their biology, the way sunlight affects vampires in folklore. This fits with broader speculation about what 30 years of viral evolution in radioactive environment might produce. If infected organisms adapted to perpetual darkness, if their sensory systems evolved to navigate without visual input, then sudden exposure to light could trigger defensive paralysis, a hardwired response to stimulus they're no longer equipped to process. They freeze not because light hurts them, but because their nervous systems can't integrate the information, creating temporary sensory overload that manifests as catatonic stillness. The genius of this mechanic, if it's real, is how it inverts traditional survival horror power dynamics. Usually light empowers players. You're safer with flashlight than without, but in Requiem, light becomes double-edged tool. It freezes some enemies but attracts others. It reveals threats but also reveals you. It solves immediate problems but creates new vulnerabilities. Every time you light that lighter, you're making bet about which danger matters more right now, the one you can see or the one that's hunting you. And here's the truly disturbing possibility. What if Grace herself is affected by the light mechanics? What if her exposure to whatever is in Raccoon City's environment, her genetic inheritance from Alyssa's Epsilon strain infection and subsequent cure, makes her partially susceptible to the same light-based paralysis that freezes the white-gowned enemies? What if using light too much doesn't just drain resources but slowly transforms Grace, making her more like the thing she's trying to escape, blurring the line between investigator and subject? The lighter becomes metaphor then. Every time Grace lights it, she's illuminating truth, but also revealing her own changing nature. She's pushing back darkness, but also surrendering to what the darkness has made necessary. The light that protects her also marks her as belonging to this place, to these ruins, to whatever emerged from 30 years of sealed contamination. She came here to investigate her mother's death, but maybe what she's really investigating is her own inevitable transformation into something that can survive what Raccoon City has become. The Renwood Hotel, architecture of conspiracy. Let's talk about the building itself, because the Renwood Hotel is more than just a setting. It's evidence, it's argument, it's the physical manifestation of the conspiracy that Alyssa Ashcroft died trying to expose, and that Grace Ashcroft is now being sent to investigate. The hotel appears in marketing materials as a specific location with a distinct architecture. It's not the Raccoon City ruins themselves, but a structure near or within the exclusion zone, close enough that investigating it requires entering or approaching the sealed area. This raises immediate questions. When was it built? Who built it? And why would anyone construct a hotel anywhere near a radioactive crater that's supposedly too dangerous for civilian access? The answer might be that the Renwood Hotel was never really a hotel. Intelligence agencies and military organizations have a long tradition of using civilian structures as cover for covert operations. Hotels make excellent fronts because they explain constant turnover of personnel, unusual hours, suspicious activities. Someone arrives with heavy equipment at 3 in the morning, their early check-in for a conference, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, private security for important guests, strange sounds in the basement, maintenance issues. If the Renwood Hotel was built after Raccoon City's destruction to serve as monitoring station or research facility, that would explain why Alyssa was there in 2020. She wasn't investigating a hotel. She was investigating what the hotel was hiding, and what it was hiding was evidence that Raccoon City's containment had failed, that the sealed zone was still active, that 30 years of viral evolution was producing results that someone, government agencies, private contractors, umbrella remnants, wanted to study and potentially weaponize. The Gamescom trailer gives us crucial environmental details. We see Grace exploring the hotel's interior, and the architecture is significant. There's the main hall that evokes the Raccoon Police Department's entrance from Resident Evil 2 Remake, suggesting deliberate callback to that location's design philosophy. There's the Chronic Care Center, medical facility that shouldn't exist in a hotel unless the hotel's actual purpose involved treating or studying infected subjects. There are isolation wards with red lighting, suggesting quarantine areas for containing hazardous materials or contaminated individuals. This isn't hospitality architecture. This is research facility architecture disguised with hotel aesthetics. The paintings on walls, the furniture in rooms, the lobby's welcoming design, these are camouflage. Underneath is a facility designed to process people in and out of Raccoon City's exclusion zone, to conduct research on samples recovered from the ruins, possibly to experiment on subjects who either volunteered or were coerced into exposure to whatever's evolving in those sealed areas. The presence of Alyssa's hidden files becomes crucial here. Trailers show Grace discovering documents that her mother concealed behind a painting in the hotel. "What did you hide behind that painting?" Grace asks, speaking to her dead mother's memory, trying to understand what Alyssa had discovered. Those files likely contain evidence of the Renwood Hotel's real purpose, documentation of who's running it, possibly even research data on what 30 years of Raccoon City contamination has produced. This explains why Alyssa was killed. She didn't just stumble onto minor conspiracy. She uncovered the central lie that Raccoon City's destruction solved the bioweapon problem, when in fact it just sealed the problem away and allowed it to evolve undisturbed for 3 decades. She found proof that government agencies were not only aware of ongoing viral activity but actively studying it, potentially harvesting it, maybe even deliberately allowing it to continue because the research was too valuable to terminate. The hooded figure's presence at the hotel suggests they're either running the operation or are key participant. Their laboratory or office setup seen in trailers, complete with examination equipment and preserved specimens, indicates they've been conducting research at this location for extended period. The aged appearance of some equipment suggests this isn't recent installation. Someone's been working here for years, possibly decades, using the Renwood Hotel as base of operations for studying Raccoon City's evolution. Grace's assignment to investigate mysterious deaths at the hotel takes on sinister dimensions when we consider this context. If the hotel is research facility, then the deaths Nathan Dempsey is sending Grace to investigate aren't random outbreak victims. They're failed experiments, test subjects, researchers who got infected by what they were studying. The official story about an unidentified disease is cover for continued bioweapon incidents occurring at facility that's supposedly monitoring rather than actively experimenting. And Grace is being sent in with minimal briefing, minimal backup, minimal resources. Either Demps is incompetent, failing to recognize that he's sending an analyst into active biohazard zone, or he's complicit, deliberately sending Alyssa Ashcroft's daughter to the location where her mother died because someone wants to see how Grace performs, how she reacts, whether she inherited anything from her mother beyond determination and curiosity. The hotel's location matters too. If it's positioned on the edge of the Raccoon City exclusion zone rather than deep within it, that suggests it serves as transition point, a place where people enter or exit the sealed area. Researchers going in to collect samples would stage at the Renwood Hotel, undergoing decontamination procedures before returning to civilian areas. Test subjects might be housed there before and after exposure to viral agents. The hotel becomes buffer zone between contaminated ruins and normal world, a place where the impossible coexists with the mundane. This creates opportunities for horror that go beyond simple monster encounters. Imagine Grace discovering that the hotel's guest registry lists people who checked in but never checked out, that room numbers corresponding to isolation wards contain evidence of long-term occupation by individuals who were neither guests nor voluntary participants. Imagine finding medical records showing progression of infection in subjects who were deliberately exposed to viral samples recovered from Raccoon City, documentation of how various strains affected different genetic profiles, notes about which subjects survived long enough to produce interesting mutations. The hotel becomes haunted then, but not by ghosts. It's haunted by the living consequences of research that should never have been conducted, by people who were turned into experiments against their will, or who volunteered because they were desperate enough to believe promises about compensation, about contributing to science, about being part of something important. The white-gowned enemies might not be random infected. They might be former residents of the hotel, former subjects, people who were housed in those chronic care units and exposed to contamination until they transformed into something that can't leave, that wanders the halls forever, frozen in light and active in darkness. And somewhere in this building, in a locked room that requires Alyssa's hidden information to access, there might be the ultimate revelation, the complete documentation of what Raccoon City has become over 30 years, what the government knew and when they knew it, and most damning of all, who's been profiting from studying it instead of properly destroying it. The Renwood Hotel isn't a location. It's evidence of crime so vast that its exposure would destabilize governments, destroy careers, potentially trigger international incidents. Alyssa died because she found that evidence. Grace is being sent to find it again, either to expose it or to be silenced by it. The question is which outcome those who sent her are actually hoping for. Combat versus stealth, the marketing mystery. One of the most contentious debates in the Resident Evil community since Requiem's announcement involves a conspicuous absence in the marketing, substantial combat gameplay. We've seen Grace hold weapons. We've glimpsed her firing a magnum in one brief trailer shot that cuts away before impact. But compared to the extensive combat showcases that preceded previous Resident Evil releases, Requiem's promotional materials have been almost aggressively evasive about showing players fighting enemies. This absence has spawned multiple theories. Some fans worry that Capcom is minimizing combat because the game is predominantly stealth-based, that Grace's vulnerability and lack of combat training means most encounters will involve hiding and running rather than fighting. Others speculate that the combat exists but is being saved for January showcase and public demo, that Capcom is deliberately withholding to maintain mystery and generate discussion. A third faction believes something more complex is happening, that combat exists but is relegated to specific portions of the game or specific characters, suggesting Grace might not be the only playable protagonist. The evidence for each theory is circumstantial but intriguing. The stealth-focused interpretation points to Grace's characterization as analyst rather than field agent, to the emphasis on the lighter as tool rather than weapon, to the way trailers show her hiding under tables and behind walls rather than standing and fighting. The enemies we've seen, particularly the stalker that can move through walls and the white-gowned figures that might freeze in light, seem designed to be evaded rather than defeated. There's no UI visible when Grace aims the magnum, suggesting that moment might be cutscene or scripted event rather than representative gameplay. The January reveal theory draws support from Capcom's established marketing patterns. Resident Evil 2 Remake withheld substantial combat footage until its demo release, allowing players to discover the intensity of its action firsthand rather than through trailers. Village similarly held back its later game weapons and more empowered sections, presenting marketing that emphasized horror over firepower even though the full game featured significant combat. Requiem could be following this template, showing only early game sections where Grace is underpowered and vulnerable, saving revelation of more substantial arsenal for when players actually get their hands on the demo. The multiple protagonist theory is more speculative, but carries interesting weight. Rumors and supposed leaks have suggested Leon Kennedy might appear in Requiem, possibly a secondary playable character representing the combat-focused portion of the game, while Grace handles investigation and survival horror sections. This would mirror earlier Resident Evil titles that alternated between characters with different strengths, Leon and Claire in 2, Chris and Jill in the original, Ethan and Chris in Village's DLC. The Magnum on the Collector's Edition Steelbook becomes key piece of evidence in this debate. Why feature a weapon so prominently in the game's physical marketing if combat is minimal? Why choose the Magnum specifically, a weapon that traditionally appears in Resident Evil games as powerful but rare tool for handling toughest enemies? The Steelbook design suggests combat is significant enough to warrant its visual representation, that players will indeed use firearms to survive encounters rather than exclusively relying on stealth. But here's where things get interesting, where we can synthesize these theories into a more complete picture of what Requiem might actually be doing. What if all three theories are partially correct? What if Requiem is structured to transition from survival horror to survival action over its runtime, with Grace beginning vulnerable and underpowered but gradually acquiring weapons, skills, and confidence as her investigation deepens? This would make thematic and mechanical sense. Grace starts as analyst thrust into field work she's unprepared for. Early encounters are terrifying because she can't effectively fight. She hides, she runs, she uses environmental tools like light to manipulate enemy behavior. This creates survival horror atmosphere, emphasizing vulnerability and resource management. Players feel Grace's fear because they share her limited capabilities. But as the story progresses, as Grace discovers more about what happened to her mother and what's really happening in Raccoon City, she adapts. She finds weapons. She learns to use them. Her confidence grows. The game shifts from pure horror toward survival action, maintaining tension through escalating enemy threats and resource scarcity, but allowing players to fight back more effectively. By the game's final act, when Grace presumably enters Raccoon City's ruins proper, she's armed and capable, ready to face whatever 30 years of evolution has created. This structure would explain the marketing dichotomy. Early game footage emphasizes stealth and vulnerability because that's Grace's starting state. later game combat exists but isn't being shown because Capcom wants players to experience that progression organically, to feel the satisfaction of going from helpless analyst to competent survivor through their own gameplay rather than having it spoiled in trailers. The Leon Kennedy rumors, if true, could represent a parallel campaign or playable flashback sections that provide contrast to Grace's storyline. While Grace struggles through the Renwood Hotel with minimal equipment, perhaps we occasionally play as Leon investigating government cover-up from different angle, well-armed and experienced, providing action-focused gameplay that complements Grace's horror-focused sections. This would give players both experiences, the vulnerability they want from survival horror and the empowerment they expect from Resident Evil combat, without compromising either. Or maybe the entire debate is misdirection. Maybe Capcom is withholding combat footage not because it doesn't exist, but because the combat itself is spoiler, revealing something about the story they don't want known yet. If Grace's blood or genetics are key to the plot, if her transformation into something enhanced or modified is central narrative thread, then showing her using weapons effectively might spoil that revelation. Late game Grace, with enhanced reflexes and strength, cutting down enemies with ease because she's been changed by her exposure to Raccoon City's environment, would be massive spoiler that trailers absolutely should not reveal. The marketing mystery might be statement of intent. Requiem is not afraid to withhold information, to let players discover its secrets firsthand, to trust that the reputation built by previous games and the intrigue generated by careful marketing will carry interest through the months before release without needing to show everything. In an era where game marketing often reveals too much, where trailers spoil story beats, and gameplay showcases eliminate mystery, Capcom's restraint with Requiem might be the smartest move they could make. We'll know the truth soon enough. January's showcase and demo will presumably settle the debate definitively. But until then, the mystery itself generates engagement, drives discussion, keeps Requiem in community consciousness even during marketing quiet periods. Whether combat is minimal, substantial, or evolving over the game's runtime, Capcom has successfully made its absence from marketing into talking point that keeps fans invested and analyzing every new piece of information. And really, that's what good marketing does. It makes you want to know more. It makes you willing to wait, to speculate, to engage with community theories, while counting down days until you can finally experience the game yourself and discover which speculations were accurate and which were red herrings. The combat debate is Requiem's central marketing mystery, and Capcom is playing it perfectly. The 30-year evolution, what biology becomes when humanity isn't watching. Let's engage in thought experiment grounded in what we know about viral biology, radiation effects, and ecosystem evolution. What happens when engineered bioweapons are sealed in radioactive environment for 30 years with no human intervention, no containment protocols, no active management? What does evolution produce when selection pressures are extreme and the organisms involved were designed to adapt and overcome? Resident Evil's bioweapons were never meant to remain stable. T-virus was explicitly designed to reanimate dead tissue, to override cellular death, to maintain function despite catastrophic damage. G-virus took this further, granting not just resilience but rapid mutation, allowing infected organisms to respond to threats by immediately altering their biology. These aren't passive infections. They're active systems that manipulate host genetics to ensure survival and propagation. When the Raccoon City missile struck in October of 1998, it killed the active infected creatures, Zombies, lickers, tyrants, all the things shambling through streets or lurking in sewers. The heat and concussive force destroyed living tissue, but deep underground, in reinforced laboratory facilities buried beneath layers of concrete and steel, virus samples in cryogenic storage or sealed containers weathered the blast. Not all of them, maybe not even most, but some, enough. And then those surviving samples had 30 years. Normal pathogens die without hosts. They need living cells to replicate, living systems to sustain them. But T virus and G virus were designed for bioweapon applications, meaning they needed environmental stability, the ability to remain viable in storage, in transport, in battlefield conditions where host availability isn't guaranteed. They're hardy in ways natural viruses aren't, capable of surviving dormancy for extended periods before encountering suitable tissue. In Raccoon City's sealed ruins, these dormant samples would have been exposed to radiation from the thermobaric weapons fallout. Radiation damages DNA through ionization, creating breaks and errors in genetic sequences. For normal organisms, this is lethal, but for viruses that already manipulate genetics as their core function, radiation becomes something different: mutagen, accelerant, source of variation upon which selection can operate. Over 3 decades, virus samples exposed to low-level constant radiation would accumulate mutations at rates far exceeding natural viral evolution. Most mutations would be neutral or harmful, producing non-viable variants. But viruses reproduce rapidly when they encounter hosts, and Raccoon City's ruins, while largely dead, wouldn't be completely sterile. Rats, insects, possibly even plants growing in the irradiated soil, these could serve as temporary hosts, allowing viral replication, creating opportunities for adaptive mutations to proliferate, while maladaptive ones died out. The selection pressure in this environment would be unique. Survival wouldn't depend on traditional fitness markers like reproduction rate or transmission efficiency. Instead, it would depend on radiation resistance, on the ability to maintain function in environments saturated with ionizing particles, on developing mechanisms to repair radiation-induced genetic damage or incorporate it into adaptive strategies. The white-gowned enemies we see in trailers might be product of this evolution. They're not zombies in the traditional sense, shambling, mindless, driven only by hunger. They move with purpose. They respond to stimuli in complex ways. They exhibit behaviors suggesting retained or regained intelligence. They're not reanimated corpses. They're something that evolved to thrive in contaminated environment, something adapted to darkness and radiation and the specific chemical composition of Raccoon City's ruins after 30 years of decay and transformation. If these creatures are photophobic, freezing when exposed to light, that's not random quirk, that's adaptation. In the perpetual darkness of sealed underground facilities, visual systems would atrophy. Organisms that could navigate without light would outcompete those dependent on vision. Light becomes disorienting stimulus, something these evolved infected can't process effectively, triggering defensive paralysis as hardwired response to sensory input. Their neurology is no longer equipped to handle. The stalker enemy represents a different evolutionary path, where white-gowned enemies adapted to specific environmental niche. The stalker might be generalist, something that evolved flexibility rather than specialization. Its ability to move through walls suggests its physical structure has become less solid, more fluid, possibly through mutation that altered cellular cohesion. This sounds impossible until you remember that T-virus already manipulates cellular biology in impossible ways. reanimating dead tissue, maintaining function without blood flow or oxygen, an evolution that reduces density, that allows infected tissue to flow through gaps in architecture the way liquid seeps through cracks, becomes just a matter of degree rather than kind. This creature's attraction to light creates interesting evolutionary logic. If most infected evolved away from light dependence, becoming photophobic specialists in darkness, then a predator that could hunt those creatures would need different adaptation. By being drawn to light, by tracking sources of illumination, the stalker would know where potential prey are hiding, because anything using light in this environment is foreign, is vulnerable, is something that doesn't belong, and therefore represents either threat or food. The 30 years matter because evolution requires time. Single generation isn't enough for dramatic adaptive change, but viruses reproduce rapidly, and if infected organisms could maintain some level of metabolic activity even in dormant state, then 30 years represents thousands of generations, countless opportunities for mutation and selection. The Raccoon City exclusion zone becomes laboratory for directed evolution, with radiation providing mutagens, darkness providing selection pressure, and complete isolation from human intervention, allowing the process to continue uninterrupted. And here's the truly disturbing possibility. What if this evolution produced something viable, something stable, something that represents genuine adaptive success rather than just movie monster horror? What if the organisms in Raccoon City's ruins aren't abominations struggling to survive, but rather successful species that have carved out ecological niche in an environment that would kill anything normal? If that's true, then opening the seal isn't just releasing monsters. It's introducing stable invasive species into outside world, species adapted to survive in contaminated environments, species that could establish themselves anywhere there's radiation or darkness or chemical pollution, species that could outcompete normal organisms because they evolved in crucible that makes normal environmental stressors trivial by comparison. Raccoon City's ruins wouldn't be graveyard, they'd be nursery. 3 decades of isolated evolution producing entirely new forms of life that humanity never anticipated because we've never sealed bioweapons away in radioactive environment long enough to see what happens when evolution gets to work. The stalker, the white-gowned enemies, whatever else Grace encounters, these aren't lingering remnants of 1998. They're the future, the demonstration of what happens when humanity's weapons are left to evolve beyond their original design parameters. And Grace Ashcroft is about to become the first person in 30 years to document that evolution, assuming she survives long enough to tell anyone what she found. The playable demo and January showcase what we'll actually learn. As of this recording, we're 4 months away from Resident Evil Requiem's launch on February 27th, 2026. That feels simultaneously distant and immediate. Distant because 4 months is significant time for anticipation to build and speculation to develop. Immediate because in gaming development timelines, 4 months means the game is essentially complete, locked in, being polished rather than fundamentally changed. What we're going to play in February already exists right now in finished or near finished form, which makes January crucial. Capcom has confirmed a Resident Evil showcase is planned for early 2026, and based on their historical patterns, this is when we'll get public demo. Not the closed doors demo that's been shown at conventions since summer. That's marketing preview, controlled experience for press and influencers. The January demo will be the one everyone can download and play, the one that determines whether pre-orders surge or retreat, the one that settles months of speculation and debate. History suggests this demo will be substantial. Resident Evil 2 Remake's demo allowed players to experience the game's opening in Raccoon Police Department. 3 Remake let players escape Jill's apartment building and explore nearby streets. Village offered castle sections and combat encounters. These demos weren't vertical slices or proof of concepts. They were actual game content, representative of final product's quality and design philosophy. For Requiem, the smart money says we'll get Renwood Hotel section. This makes narrative sense. It's where the story begins. It's where Grace first encounters the horror awaiting her. It's self-contained enough that playing it won't spoil later story beats about Raccoon City proper. It makes mechanical sense, too. The hotel is where players will learn the game systems, where light mechanics and stealth dynamics and whatever combat exists will be introduced gradually. It's tutorial area disguised as genuine horror experience, teaching through play rather than exposition. The convention demos reportedly lasted around 20 to 30 minutes, short enough to be digestible in busy show floor environment, but long enough to give meaningful sense of the game's pacing and atmosphere. The public demo will probably be similar length, maybe slightly extended, to allow for player experimentation and exploration beyond critical path. One-shot format is likely. Play once with time limit, then it locks until full game releases. This creates urgency, forces players to commit to choices rather than repeatedly replaying to optimize strategies, maintain sense of vulnerability and consequence that defines survival horror. What the demo will answer: first, the combat question. We'll finally know definitively how much shooting happens, how empowered Grace feels with weapons, whether combat is viable strategy or desperate last resort. The community has spent months debating this, and 20 minutes of gameplay will settle it immediately. Second, the light mechanics. If the theory about enemies freezing in light is correct, the demo will demonstrate it explicitly. We'll understand fuel economy, how long the lighter lasts, whether there are other light sources, how to balance illumination for puzzle solving versus enemy manipulation. Third, the atmosphere and pacing. Trailers can't convey how a game actually feels to play, how tension builds during exploration, how much time passes between encounters. The demo will show whether Requiem is slow burn dread or constant threat, whether it's closer to original Resident Evil's deliberate pacing or Resident Evil 7's relentless pressure. Fourth, the perspective options. Being able to switch freely between first and third person view is revolutionary for Resident Evil, and the demo will let players experiment with how each perspective changes the experience. First person for intimacy and immersion, third person for spatial awareness and aesthetic appreciation. The ability to swap at will suggests Capcom is confident both perspectives work well, that this isn't compromise but genuine feature. But more than answering specific questions, the January demo will shift the conversation. Right now, discussion is speculation-based, theory crafting from limited information. After the demo, discussion becomes experience-based, people comparing notes about what they found, what worked for them, what genuinely scared them. The demo transforms Requiem from abstract concept into concrete reality that thousands of players have touched. It also creates new form of marketing. Players who love the demo become evangelists, sharing clips on social media, streaming their playthroughs, convincing friends to try it. Positive word of mouth from demo typically drives sales more effectively than traditional advertising because it comes from peers rather than marketers, from genuine enthusiasm rather than commercial interest. Conversely, If the demo disappoints, that spreads equally fast, potentially damaging launch momentum if enough people feel let down by what they played. Capcom is confident enough to release demo just 1 month before launch. That's faith in their product. Most games bury bad demos or skip them entirely if internal feedback is poor. Releasing demo this close to launch means Capcom believes exposure will help rather than hurt, that letting people play will generate excitement rather than concern. The showcase itself will probably include more than just demo announcement. We'll likely get extended gameplay trailers showing sections beyond the demo's scope. Maybe our first real look at Raccoon City ruins if Grace reaches them in the game's second half. Character trailers are possible. Proper introduction to Grace's personality and background, possibly confirmation of other playable or major supporting characters, if Leon Kennedy or anyone else appears. Story trailer is probable too, something that clarifies the central narrative without spoiling major twists. We know Grace is investigating her mother's murder, and that investigation leads to Raccoon City, but there's obviously more to it. The showcase could establish the stakes more clearly. What specifically did Alyssa discover? Who's really behind the Renwood Hotel? What's the hooded figure's actual plan? Pre-order push will intensify. The showcase will emphasize that February 27th is approaching, that deluxe edition content is available, that playing the demo should convince players to secure their copies. Marketing always ramps up in final month, transitioning from building awareness to closing sales. The demo and showcase together represent that transition point, the moment when Requiem moves from that game we're anticipating to that game we're about to play. For content creators and community members, January becomes busy period. Demo playthroughs, analysis videos, comparison between demo and trailers, speculation about what wasn't shown. The discourse intensifies because everyone finally has shared experience to reference, common ground for discussion rather than individual interpretations of marketing materials. And for Capcom, the showcase is final major marketing beat before launch. Whatever they reveal in January needs to sustain excitement through February without oversaturating and exhausting audience interest. It's delicate balance. Show enough to generate enthusiasm, withhold enough to preserve mystery. Based on their handling of previous games, they understand this balance well. The January showcase won't spoil Requiem, but it will make the wait until February 27th feel longer, while simultaneously making that date feel more real, more imminent, more inevitable. 4 months until launch, 1 month until the showcase and demo, 120 days that feel both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close, depending on whether you're eager for answers or enjoying the speculation phase where anything remains possible. Either way, January is coming, and with it, the moment when Requiem stops being abstract concept and becomes something we can actually touch, play, and fear. The Leon Kennedy question, evidence, rumors, and what it might mean. No discussion of Resident Evil Requiem speculation would be complete without addressing the elephant in the room, Leon S. Kennedy. Since the game's announcement, rumors about Leon's involvement have proliferated across community forums, Discord servers, and social media platforms. Some whispers suggest he's secondary playable character. Others claim he appears in cutscenes or side missions. A few assert he's not present at all, that the rumors are entirely fabricated by over-enthusiastic fans desperate to see their favorite character return. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. A PlayStation Store listing in Portugal allegedly showed Leon Kennedy's skin available as deluxe edition content. though screenshots circulated show inconsistencies that could indicate either regional listing error or skilled image manipulation. Trailer audio includes a voice line, "We need to move now," that sounds remarkably like Nick Apostolides, Leon's voice actor in recent games, though without confirmation it could be different actor or even reused audio from previous titles. A particularly intriguing piece of supposed evidence comes from the reveal trailer itself. In the sequence showing destroyed Raccoon City, eagle-eyed fans identified what appears to be Leon's Jeep parked outside the ruined Raccoon Police Department. The vehicle's model and coloration match the car Leon drove in Resident Evil 2 Remake's opening sequence. If this is intentional reference rather than asset reuse for background detail, it suggests Leon has returned to Raccoon City at some point between the original Outbreak and Requiem's present-day events. Director Koshi Nakanishi has been coy when asked directly about Leon's involvement. At Tokyo Game Show, he told an interviewer that Leon Kennedy is quite a bad match for horror, because Leon's experience and combat proficiency make him less vulnerable than protagonists like Grace Ashcroft. This could be a polite way of confirming Leon isn't in the game. If the game is designed around vulnerability, a seasoned agent like Leon wouldn't fit thematically, or it could be misdirection, suggesting Leon isn't the primary focus while leaving door open for his appearance in different capacity. The thematic argument against Leon's inclusion is compelling. Requiem is explicitly about returning to roots, emphasizing survival horror over action spectacle, prioritizing fear and resource management over empowered combat. Leon Kennedy, 28 years after Raccoon City, would be in his 40s, a veteran of multiple bioterrorism incidents, someone whose face lost Plagas parasites, fought alongside Chris Redfield, saved the president's daughter. He's not someone who gets scared easily. He's not someone who runs from infected instead of shooting them. He's not someone whose inclusion would naturally support the vulnerable, atmospheric horror that Nakanishi keeps emphasizing. But there's counter-argument. Requiem isn't just about present-day investigation. It's about 30 years of history, about what happened to Raccoon City after the outbreak, and how that history has been suppressed. If the story includes flashbacks or parallel narratives showing events from multiple time periods, Leon could appear in sections set closer to the original Raccoon City incident or in its immediate aftermath. A younger Leon, still traumatized by what he experienced, being recruited by government agencies and sent on missions related to Raccoon City's containment, would fit thematically while providing combat-focused gameplay segments that contrast with Grace's survival horror sections. This dual protagonist structure has precedent in Resident Evil. The original game allowed players to choose between Chris and Jill, experiencing different perspectives on same events. Resident Evil 2 featured Leon and Claire with intersecting storylines. Village's DLC gave players brief control of Chris Redfield after spending main game as Ethan Winters. Requiem could follow similar pattern, primarily play as Grace, investigating in present day, occasionally switch to Leon in flashbacks, showing earlier events that contextualize what Grace discovers. This structure would explain the magnum on the steelbook and the apparent de-emphasis of combat in marketing. Grace's sections are stealth and survival focused, true to the horror roots Capcom keeps highlighting. Leon's sections, set years or decades earlier, are combat focused, allowing players who want action to get it while maintaining the game's overall horror atmosphere. The marketing shows Grace because she's the primary protagonist and the face of Requiem's return to horror philosophy. Leon is held back as reveal, as surprise, for longtime fans as answer to the question, where's the combat, that avoids spoiling his role in the story. Another possibility, Leon appears but isn't playable. He could be NPC guide, someone Grace contacts for information about Raccoon City's history and what government agencies know about the site. Phone conversations or video calls where Leon provides context, warns Grace about dangers, possibly reveals his own guilt about not doing more to expose the truth about what's been happening in the exclusion zone. This would give fans Leon content without compromising Requiem's focus on Grace's vulnerable experience. Or maybe the rumors are just wrong. Maybe Leon doesn't appear at all, and community's desperation to see fan-favorite characters has created speculation from minimal evidence. The voice line is different actor. The Jeep is reused asset. The Portuguese store listing was either error or fake. Leon stays off screen, his story continuing in whatever comes after Requiem rather than being retroactively inserted into this particular narrative. The frustrating reality is we won't know until January's showcase or the game's actual release. Capcom has successfully maintained ambiguity, neither confirming nor definitively denying Leon's involvement. If he's in the game, the reveal will be a significant marketing moment. If he's not, the rumors will have served purpose of keeping Requiem in discussion, keeping fans engaged with speculation even when official news is scarce. Here's the position I'm taking. Leon Kennedy probably appears in Requiem in some capacity, but probably not as primary playable character for entire game. The evidence, while circumstantial, is too consistent and too widespread to be entirely fabricated. But the thematic focus on vulnerability and horror, the emphasis on Grace as protagonist who's defined by her lack of combat experience, suggests that if Leon is playable, it's in limited capacity. Flashback sequences, specific missions, unlockable content, or brief sections that provide perspective shift without dominating the overall experience. This middle ground makes sense commercially too. Capcom can appeal to fans who want to see Leon again without compromising the creative vision of Requiem as return to survival horror. They can have both the vulnerable new protagonist and the competent returning favorite, satisfying different player preferences through structural design rather than forcing uncomfortable compromises that would weaken both elements. But until Capcom actually shows us Leon, or definitively confirms his absence, this remains speculation, educated guessing based on limited evidence and franchise history. The Leon Kennedy question is Requiem's secondary mystery, less central than what happened to Raccoon City, but more personally invested for many fans. Whether he appears or not, the discussion itself has value, keeping community engaged, generating theories, maintaining interest during the long wait between announcement and release. And really, that's what smart marketing does when it can't or won't provide direct answers. It creates space for speculation, allows community to fill gaps with their own theories, turns absence of information into its own form of engagement. Leon Kennedy might be in Requiem, might not be, but either way, fans are talking about it, thinking about it, anticipating the reveal. Mission accomplished. The collector's edition debate and physical media's uncertain future. The announcement of Requiem's collector's edition sparked controversy in ways that reveal broader tensions in gaming's relationship with physical media, fan expectations, and the economics of special editions. At the center of the debate, the decision to replace traditional statue with an acrylic stand featuring artwork of protagonist Grace Ashcroft. This seemingly minor change ignited passionate discussions about value, effort, and what limited editions should provide to justify their premium pricing. Resident Evil has built reputation for impressive collector's editions. The Resident Evil 2 remake came with meticulously detailed statue of Leon Kennedy fighting zombies. 3's edition featured Jill Valentine. Village gave us massive Chris Redfield bust. These weren't cheap plastic toys. They were substantial display pieces, physical representations of the game's iconic characters, collectibles that fans would proudly showcase alongside their games and consoles. The acrylic stand feels like downgrade by comparison. Its flat printed artwork attached to base, more akin to standee you'd see in retail store promoting a game than collectible worthy of premium edition. The steelbook case is nice but hardly unique. Most deluxe editions include steelbooks now. The lenticular card inside the steelbook is interesting but small. The costume pack, weapon skins, and digital bonuses are standard fare for deluxe editions across the industry. Nothing about this package screams collector's edition the way previous Resident Evil offerings did. Fan response was predictably negative. Comments across forums and social media expressed disappointment, accused Capcom of laziness, questioned whether the edition was worth its price point. Some speculated this signals Capcom reducing investment in physical editions as industry transitions increasingly toward digital distribution. Others wondered whether development budget constraints forced cuts to collector's edition quality. A few suggested this might be regional, Japan's version including the acrylic stand, while other territories might receive different offerings. That last point deserves attention. Collector's editions often vary by region, with European and Asian markets sometimes receiving different contents than North American releases. It's possible, even likely, that other territories will get different packages. UK editions in particular have historically included better bonuses than US releases for various franchises. Fans hoping for statue-inclusive version should watch for announcements from European retailers or direct Japan imports. But there's bigger picture here about physical media's economics. Statues are expensive to manufacture. They require sculpting, mold creation, production runs that need to be large enough to achieve reasonable per-unit costs. They're fragile, requiring careful packaging that increases shipping weight and dimensions, driving up distribution costs. They take up warehouse space. They create quality control issues. Paint applications vary. Pieces arrive damaged. Customer service has to handle replacements and refunds. From publisher perspective, simpler collector's editions with less elaborate physical components make financial sense. Lower production costs mean higher profit margins or ability to price competitively. Reduced packaging complexity means fewer logistics headaches. Digital bonuses cost nothing to manufacture beyond initial development and can be distributed instantly to infinite customers without inventory concerns. But fans aren't wrong to feel disappointed. Collector's editions exist to reward dedicated supporters, to provide physical embodiments of their passion for franchises they love. When publisher reduces quality or scope of these offerings, it communicates that dedicated fans aren't valued enough to justify proper investment. It suggests physical collecting is being phased out in favor of digital convenience, that the tangible connection to games we've enjoyed for decades is being sacrificed to spreadsheet optimization. The debate extends beyond Requiem specifically. Physical game media is arguably in decline. Many games ship on disks that contain only partial data, requiring day-one downloads to be playable. Some games ship as download codes in boxes with no physical media at all. Digital storefronts offer better prices, instant access, no shelf space requirements. For younger players who grew up digital native, physical collecting might seem anachronistic, a relic of previous generations' habits. But there's value in physical that digital can't replicate: ownership, truly owning a thing rather than licensing access to it, the ability to sell, trade, lend games to friends, the confidence that your library won't disappear if company goes under or decides to shut down servers, the simple pleasure of browsing physical collection, of seeing your gaming history displayed tangibly rather than as list in digital interface. Collector's editions represent the premium end of physical media. Their statement, "I love this thing enough to pay extra for special version, for physical collectibles that demonstrate my fandom." When those editions become underwhelming, when publishers treat them as afterthought rather than celebration, it undermines the entire value proposition of physical collecting. Some fans have responded by simply not buying the collector's edition. Vote with wallet, support physical media only when it's done well. Others are holding out hope that additional editions will be announced, a proper collector's edition with statue, maybe exclusive to certain retailers or a separate later release. The acrylic stand version might be Japan only standard, while other regions receive different packages. There's also possibility of aftermarket alternatives. Third-party companies sometimes produce unofficial collectibles, statues, art prints, replica props that serve collectors better than official offerings. If Capcom won't provide quality Grace Ashcroft statue, perhaps independent sculptor will, selling through Etsy or at conventions to fans willing to support creators who understand what collectors actually want. The broader question is whether this represents trend or isolated incident. If future Resident Evil games continue with downgraded collector's editions, if other Capcom franchises follow suit, if the industry as whole decides physical collectibles aren't worth investment, then this could mark an inflection point where physical media becomes niche market served by specialty retailers rather than mainstream component of game releases. Or maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe Capcom just made bad call on this particular edition and will course correct after seeing fan response. Maybe they're testing waters, seeing whether cheaper editions sell well enough to justify reduced production investment. Maybe the statue is coming but wasn't ready to announce with pre-orders, so they're showing what they have now and will reveal enhanced edition later. Either way, the debate matters because it's about more than one collector's edition. It's about what we value as gaming community, about whether physical collecting remains viable, about how publishers demonstrate respect for dedicated fans who support their franchises year after year. The acrylic stand might seem like minor issue in grand scheme, but it represents larger tensions about gaming's direction and what we're willing to accept as standards slide toward convenience over quality. For now, collector's edition decisions remain individual choice. If the package doesn't meet your standards, don't buy it. If you're okay with what's offered, pre-order without guilt, but pay attention to trends. Notice whether physical offerings improve or continue degrading. Support publishers who do right by collectors. And maybe if enough people speak up, companies will hear message that physical collectibles still matter, that fans will pay premium prices but only for premium products. The Requiem Collector's Edition debate isn't really about an acrylic stand. It's about respect, value, and the future of physical media in digital age. Those questions don't have simple answers, but they're worth asking as industry evolves and priorities shift. Because once physical gaming collectibles are gone, once that market collapses entirely, we won't get it back. Digital is irreversible. Physical requires constant support to survive, and that support comes from fans who care enough to complain when standards slip, who hold publishers accountable, who refuse to settle for less than what collecting deserves. Perspective shifting, first versus third person, and why it actually matters. One of Requiem's most significant mechanical innovations is the ability to freely switch between first and third person perspective at any time. This might seem like minor quality of life feature, but it represents fundamental shift in how Resident Evil approaches player agency and atmospheric horror. The choice between perspectives isn't just about preference, it's about fundamentally different ways of experiencing fear, different relationships to the character you're controlling, different strategies for navigating horror environments. First person perspective, default for Requiem, has defined the RE Engine era. Resident Evil 7 pioneered this shift, putting players directly into Ethan Winter's perspective as he explored the Baker estate. The intimacy was immediate and unsettling. When Jack Baker chased you through corridors, you felt the panic viscerally. When you opened doors, you experienced the vulnerability of crossing thresholds without knowing what waited on the other side. First person made horror personal in ways third person couldn't quite match. Village continued this approach while adding more action, demonstrating that first person worked for both horror and combat. The Duke's shop, Heisenberg's factory, Dimitrescu's castle all benefited from intimate perspective that made environments feel tangible, made threats feel immediate. You weren't watching character experience horror. You were experiencing it yourself, seeing through their eyes, feeling their fear as your own. But first person has limitations. Situational awareness suffers. You can't see enemies approaching from behind or flanking you from sides. Room layouts are harder to grasp because you can't see your character's position relative to furniture and doorways. Combat becomes more disorienting because you lack spatial context for where you are and where threats are. For players prone to motion sickness, extended first-person gameplay can be physically uncomfortable or even impossible to tolerate. Third-person perspective, traditional for Resident Evil, offers different advantages. You can see your character, which creates emotional connection. You're protecting someone you can observe rather than being someone you can't see. Situational awareness improves because camera shows broader view of environment, letting you spot threats and plan routes more effectively. Room layouts become clearer because you can see how your character relates spatially to objects and exits. Combat feels more tactical because you have better sense of positioning in enemy locations. But third person also distances you from horror. When camera is pulled back, showing you and the environment from external perspective, you're observer rather than participant. The monster chasing you is chasing a character you're watching, not chasing you personally. The jump scare is something happening on screen, not something happening to you. Horror becomes spectacle rather than experience. Scary movie you're directing rather than nightmare you're living. Requiem's innovation is letting players choose which of these experiences they prefer, allowing perspective shifts during gameplay rather than locking players into single view for entire game. This is more ambitious than it sounds. Most games that offer perspective options do so as menu setting. Choose first or third at start. Live with that choice throughout. Allowing mid-gameplay switching requires careful design. UI elements need to work in both views. Enemy encounters need to be balanced for different awareness levels. Puzzle design can't rely on specific perspective for solutions. The game needs to function equally well regardless of how players are viewing it. This flexibility serves multiple purposes. Players who love first-person horror can use it for atmospheric sections, then switch to third-person for combat or navigation when they need better situational awareness. Players with motion sickness can play primarily third-person, switching to first only for specific interactions, or puzzle solving where intimate view helps. Streamers and content creators can demonstrate the game from both perspectives, showing how the experience changes based on viewpoint. It also creates interesting strategic dimension. Imagine encountering the stalker enemy in dark corridor. In first person, it's terrifying. You hear movement but can't see it. You turn and it's there. You're completely disoriented. Switch to third person, and suddenly you have better sense of where it is, but you've also lost the oppressive intimacy that made it so frightening. The perspective itself becomes tool for managing your own fear, for controlling how much horror you're willing to endure at any given moment. Or consider the white-gowned enemies that might freeze in light. In first person, holding the lighter means illuminating what's directly ahead, but you can't see what's behind or beside you. You freeze one enemy but can't confirm whether others are approaching from different angles. Third person gives you that awareness. You can see Grace holding the lighter, see which enemies are frozen and which are still moving. Plan your path more effectively, but you've sacrificed the claustrophobic tension of first person, the feeling of being trapped with limited visibility and no safety. The choice becomes part of how you play. Aggressive players who want to confront threats might prefer third person for its tactical advantages. Cautious players who want to maximize horror might stick with first person despite its limitations. The game accommodates both playstyles, both preferences, both tolerances for fear without forcing anyone to experience it the way that least suits them. This is particularly important for accessibility. Some players physically cannot play first-person games due to motion sickness or visual processing issues. By offering third-person as full alternative rather than afterthought, Requiem ensures these players can experience the game without compromise. They're not getting inferior version or missing key content. They're playing the same game with different camera, accessing all the same areas, and facing all the same challenges. There's also fascinating narrative angle. Grace Ashcroft is character who's observing, investigating, analyzing. She's FBI analyst, someone who processes information from distance rather than being directly in the action. Third person might actually be more thematically appropriate for her character than first person, reflecting her professional habit of viewing situations from analytical remove rather than emotional immersion. But when she's terrified, when the investigation becomes personal and survival focused, first person captures that shift. She's no longer observing, she's experiencing, she's in it. Players who understand this thematic dimension can use perspective shifts to enhance their role playing. Start third person while Grace is professionally investigating, maintaining analytical distance. Switch to first person when encounters become threatening, when Grace loses her composure and becomes fully immersed in terror of her situation. The perspective becomes expression of Grace's emotional state, tool for making your playthrough feel more coherent as narrative journey. Technically, offering both perspectives without compromising either required significant development investment. Every animation needs to look good from both viewpoints. Every environment needs to be playable from both angles. The game's lighting, pacing, enemy behavior, all of it needs to work equally well whether players are looking through Grace's eyes or watching her from external camera. This is why most games don't offer this flexibility. It's expensive, time-consuming, risky. If one perspective ends up feeling better than the other, players will use only that view, making half the development effort wasted. Capcom is betting that both perspectives work well enough that players will use both, switching based on situation and preference rather than discovering one superior view and never deviating. Based on Village's RE-verse mode testing and feedback from the conventions where demo was shown, They've apparently succeeded. People who've played report that both perspectives feel polished, that switching is seamless, that the game doesn't pressure you toward either option but genuinely supports both. This sets precedent for future Resident Evil games and possibly other Capcom titles. If Requiem's perspective system works as promised, it becomes feature players will expect going forward. Why wouldn't next Resident Evil offer the same flexibility? Why wouldn't other RE Engine games adopt similar approach? The technology and design philosophy is established. The player appreciation is probable. The accessibility and preference arguments are compelling, but it also creates pressure. Future games that lock players into single perspective will face questions. Why not both? Requiem proved it's possible. Why isn't this game doing it? The innovation becomes expectation, and failing to meet expectations generates criticism even if the single perspective offered is well executed. This is risk of raising the bar. You have to keep meeting new standard or deal with disappointment. For now, Requiem's perspective flexibility is unqualified positive. It demonstrates Capcom's willingness to invest in player choice, to support multiple ways of experiencing horror, to acknowledge that different players have different needs and preferences. Whether other developers follow suit or this remains Resident Evil specific innovation remains to be seen. But either way, its statement about respecting player agency, about building games that accommodate rather than restrict, about trusting that players know what experience they want and giving them tools to achieve it. That's good game design. That's understanding your audience. That's why Resident Evil continues to define survival horror genre, not by forcing one vision on everyone, but by evolving to meet players where they are, adapting to changing needs and preferences while maintaining core identity. The perspective options aren't just nice feature, they're philosophy, demonstration that great games serve players rather than the other way around. The final countdown, what January through March will look like. We're entering the final stretch. Halloween has passed. The holidays are approaching. And beyond those, through the chaos of winter festivities and New Year celebrations, looms January and everything that comes with it. For Resident Evil fans, the next 4 months represent crescendo, the building tension before release, the period where anticipation transforms from patient waiting into active countdown. Let me paint a picture of what this timeline looks like, what we can reasonably expect based on Capcom's patterns and the information they've already confirmed. November and December will be relatively quiet. Holiday season means people are distracted by other priorities, family gatherings, gift shopping, year-end work obligations. Game marketing traditionally slows during these months because attention is divided, because marketing dollars are wasted competing with holiday noise. Expect minimal Requiem news beyond possibly some social media posts, maybe behind-the-scenes development blog entries if Capcom's feeling generous, but nothing major. This is deliberate pause before the storm. This quiet period serves purpose. It lets anticipation simmer without boiling over. It prevents marketing fatigue, the exhaustion that sets in when you've been shown too much for too long, when every piece of news becomes expected rather than exciting. By going relatively silent through holidays, Capcom ensures that January's reveal hits harder, feels more significant, captures attention more effectively because it breaks months of quiet rather than continuing endless stream of information. It also lets fans enjoy holidays without feeling obligation to constantly check for Requiem updates. You can disconnect, spend time with family, play other games without missing crucial announcements. The pause is gift, both to fans and to developers who probably also appreciate not having to maintain aggressive marketing schedule during busiest time of year. But come January, everything accelerates. The Resident Evil showcase will probably happen in the first or second week of January, positioning it early enough to build momentum toward late February release, but not so early that people are still recovering from New Year's. This showcase will be big, probably an hour or more of content, including the demo announcement, extended gameplay trailers, story reveals, possibly Leon Kennedy confirmation if that's happening, definitely collector's edition updates, and pre-order reminders. The public demo drops either same day as showcase or within week of it. This gives media outlets time to cover showcase contents, lets word spread about what was revealed, builds anticipation so that when demo becomes available, maximum number of people download and play it immediately. The demo will trend on social media, dominate gaming discussion for days or weeks, generate countless YouTube playthroughs and analysis videos. Then comes the content avalanche. Every gaming website publishes impressions. YouTubers create videos discussing every detail. Forums explode with strategy discussions, Easter egg hunts, speculation about what wasn't shown. The demo transforms conversation from abstract theory crafting to concrete analysis of actual gameplay, shifting community dynamics from imagination to evidence-based discussion. This period also sees pre-order surge. Positive demo reception drives fence sitters to commit. Negative reception causes cancellations. The demo's success or failure directly impacts launch sales projections, and Capcom will be watching those numbers closely, adjusting final marketing pushes based on response. Late January might bring additional reveals, character trailers, behind-the-scenes documentaries, interviews with developers going deeper into creative decisions. The goal is maintaining momentum from showcase and demo through rest of month, ensuring Requiem stays in consciousness, preventing attention from drifting to other games, competing for a February launch window. February arrives, and suddenly release is 3 weeks away, 2 weeks, 1 week, days. Marketing hits maximum intensity, final trailers emphasizing critical reviews, last-minute pre-order pushes, reminders about deluxe content, platform-specific promotions. PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, Steam, all push Requiem through their storefronts, featuring it prominently to ensure everyone knows it's coming. Content creators who received early review copies begin publishing reviews and preview content based on embargo schedules. Gaming media outlets post reviews, scores, analysis. The aggregate review score becomes topic of intense discussion. Will Requiem match or exceed Village's Metacritic rating? Will critics embrace the return to horror roots, or criticize it for regressing from Village's successful action-horror hybrid? Then February 27th arrives, launch day. Servers strain under load as millions download the game. Social media floods with first impressions, screenshot shares, early game discoveries. Streamers begin playthroughs. Speedrunners start routing optimal paths. The community shifts entirely from anticipation mode to experience mode, from theory to practice, from waiting to playing. But the conversation doesn't end there. March becomes about completion, analysis, retrospective. People finish the game and share reactions to ending, discuss story implications, debate whether the Spencer theory was accurate, analyze what the hooded figure's true identity and motivation reveal about Resident Evil's ongoing narrative. Speedrun times improve as strategies optimize. Challenge runs emerge. Requiem on hardest difficulty, no damage runs, item limited completions. The cycle that began with Summer Game Fest 2025's announcement completes with March 2026's post-release discussion, a 9-month journey from reveal to resolution. And through all of it, community engagement remains intense because Requiem matters. Its mainline entry and franchise people love, its return to series roots, its potentially game-changing revelation about Raccoon City's true fate. For content creators, this timeline is simultaneous opportunity and challenge. Opportunity because there's constant stream of material to cover, news to discuss, speculation to explore. Challenge because maintaining consistent output for 9 months without burning out requires planning, pacing, sustainable production schedules. The channels and creators who navigate this best are the ones who understand that marathon requires different approach than sprint, that lasting engagement beats viral intensity. For fans, the timeline is anticipation made manifest. Every month brings new reason to think about Requiem, new information to process, new theories to develop. The waiting becomes part of the experience. Communal activity where thousands of people simultaneously count down toward shared goal. By the time February 27th arrives, the anticipation has built such intensity that playing the game feels almost anticlimactic at first. Can reality match months of imagination? Usually yes, sometimes no, but either way, the journey from announcement to release is its own form of entertainment. And for Capcom, this timeline is carefully orchestrated marketing campaign designed to maximize sales while managing expectations. Reveal too early and interest fades before release. Reveal too late and you miss building anticipation. Show too much and you spoil surprises. Show too little and people worry quality is poor. The balance is delicate, and Requiem's marketing has mostly threaded that needle successfully, maintaining interest without exhausting goodwill. 4 months to go, 120 days, each one bringing us closer to answers, to playing rather than speculating, to discovering whether everything we've imagined about Raccoon City's ruins and Alyssa Ashcroft's murder and Grace's investigation matches what Capcom has actually created. The waiting is torture and pleasure simultaneously, agony of delay and joy of anticipation intertwined. But soon enough, sooner than feels possible, even as days drag, we'll know, we'll play, we'll discover. And the speculation that sustained us through these long months will transform into memory, replaced by concrete knowledge of what Requiem actually is rather than what we imagined it might be. Whether that knowledge exceeds or disappoints our hopes remains to be seen. Either way, we're almost there. The countdown continues, and February 27th approaches with the inevitability of fate. Conclusion: the Requiem that changes everything. So where does all this speculation leave us? What picture emerges when we connect all these dots, synthesize all these theories, examine all the evidence that Capcom has deliberately scattered through months of marketing? Resident Evil Requiem is not just return to Raccoon City, it's excavation of 30 years of lies, exposure of conspiracy that extends from 1998's missile strike through every government cover-up and agency obfuscation that followed. It's about journalists who discovered truth and died for it, and her daughter who's walking the same path with eyes slightly more open but protection barely better. It's about what happens when humanity's bioweapons are left to evolve without oversight, when sealed zones become laboratories for viral adaptation, when 3 decades of radiation and darkness and isolation produce organisms that represent genuine evolutionary success rather than temporary horror. It's about the stalker that moves through walls, the white-gowned enemies that freeze in light, the things that emerged when T-virus and G-virus had time and pressure to become something new. It's about Oswell Spencer's legacy manifesting through someone who believes in his vision enough to continue it, someone wearing hood and carrying scars, someone who views Grace Ashcroft not as threat, but as chosen one, as bridge between human and post-human, as demonstration that survivors' descendants carry keys to humanity's enhanced future. It's about research that never stopped, facilities disguised as hotels, monitoring stations positioned to study rather than destroy what Raccoon City has become. It's about mechanics that transform how we experience horror, light that both protects and exposes, perspective that we control rather than accepting what's imposed, enemies that respond to our choices and tools rather than following predictable patterns. It's about Grace Ashcroft developing from terrified analyst into competent survivor, learning to navigate nightmare landscape where nothing is as it seems, and everyone who sent her here might have ulterior motives. It's about Leon Kennedy maybe appearing to provide contrast, to show experienced agents' perspective on events that traumatize newcomer, to offer combat-focused gameplay that complements Grace's survival horror experience. Or maybe it's about Leon's notable absence, about protagonists succeeding without franchise icons rescuing her, about new character proving she belongs in this universe without needing established names to validate her presence. It's about collector's editions and physical media, about respecting fans enough to provide quality collectibles, or recognizing that digital future makes such offerings less economically viable. It's about pre-orders and deluxe content, about Fortnite collaborations and amiibo announcements, about the commercial machinery that keeps franchise viable, even as artistic ambitions push toward darker, more complex storytelling. It's about community speculation, about months of theory crafting and debate and analysis that transform waiting into engagement, anticipation into entertainment. It's about fans who care enough to dissect every trailer frame, who build elaborate theories from minimal evidence, who argue passionately about whether combat is adequate or perspective options matter, or Leon's involvement enhances or distracts from Grace's story. Most fundamentally, it's about Raccoon City never really ending. The missile strike didn't solve anything. It delayed, contained, sealed away the problem while creating conditions for that problem to evolve into something worse. For 30 years, the ruins have been changing, adapting, becoming something that challenges our understanding of what bioweapons are and what they might become given time and pressure and isolation. The outbreak didn't end in 1998, it transformed. And now, when Grace Ashcroft opens those doors and illuminates those ruins, we're going to see what 3 decades of evolution have produced. That's what changes everything. Not Grace's story specifically, not the gameplay mechanics or the marketing mysteries or the speculation about returning characters. What changes everything is the revelation that Resident Evil's foundational event, the incident that defined the franchise, that established the threat, that set up every subsequent game's stakes, was never actually resolved. Raccoon City is still happening. The bioweapons are still evolving. The conspiracy is still active. And everything we thought we knew about how the story progressed from 1998 forward needs reevaluation. If the government knew Raccoon City wasn't neutralized, if agencies have been studying it for decades, if Umbrella's research continued under different names and different covers, then every subsequent outbreak takes on new implications. Were they accidents or controlled tests? Were they independent incidents or connected experiments? Did BSAA and TerraSave and other organizations actually combat bioterrorism, or just manage it, containing visible threats while secret research continued? Grace's investigation isn't just about her mother's murder. It's about pulling thread that unravels entire tapestry, exposing framework of lies that held Resident Evil's universe together. When she discovers truth, when she documents what's in those ruins and what's been done with it, the repercussions will extend beyond Requiem into whatever comes next for franchise. That's why this game matters. That's why speculation has been so intense. That's why community engagement remains high even during marketing quiet periods. Requiem isn't just another entry in series. It's potential inflection point, moment where everything changes, where past reveals itself as fiction and future becomes uncertain. Whether Capcom actually delivers on this potential remains to be seen. Maybe I've overinterpreted, read too much into marketing breadcrumbs, constructed elaborate theory from insufficient evidence. Maybe Requiem is simpler story. Daughter investigates mother's death, discovers local corruption, escapes with truth. Maybe the ruins are just setting rather than revolution. Maybe 30 years of evolution produces scary monsters but no deeper implication. But I don't think so. I think Capcom is building towards something significant, something that justifies calling this entry Requiem rather than Resident Evil 9. A Requiem isn't just mourning, it's acknowledgement of death, acceptance of loss, commitment to remember what was taken. Requiem for Raccoon City means finally telling truth about what died there and what didn't, about who's been lying and why, about what prices were paid and who paid them. The game launches February 27th, 2026. In 4 months, speculation becomes certainty. Theories are confirmed or debunked. Questions receive answers. And the Resident Evil franchise either continues on its established trajectory or pivots dramatically based on what Requiem reveals about Raccoon City, about bioweapon evolution, about government conspiracy, about the foundations upon which 3 decades of stories have been built. Until then, we wait, we speculate, we analyze every new piece of information, every trailer frame, every developer comment. We build theories and defend them. We argue about interpretations. We count down days while simultaneously wishing time would slow because anticipation itself has value, because not knowing creates space for imagination that knowing will necessarily collapse. Raccoon City awaits. The ruins have been sealed for 30 years, and Grace Ashcroft is about to learn what emerges when humanity's weapons are left alone to evolve, to adapt, to become something we never intended and can't control. The Requiem is about to begin, and when it does, everything changes.